Hello, welcome to NASA's Golden Winged Astronauts. This is a program about the Naval and Marine aviators of Project Mercury. It was originally intended to be a live tour conducted at the Wings of Freedom Aviation Museum, but as we know, circumstances dictate that the museum remain closed for the foreseeable future. Once it opens, perhaps we will be able to conduct this tour, and I'm certainly looking forward to that. My name is Brian Heck. I'm a volunteer at the Wings of Freedom Museum, and I'm also a Solar System Ambassador, which is a program run by NASA and JPL. I put this program together, and I will be your virtual docent for the tour today. Following some early Russian successes in space, notably Sputnik and Gagarin orbiting the planet, NASA was under a lot of pressure to get things moving, so they developed Project Mercury. There was an arduous selection process, and we came down to these 7 men who were our first astronauts. If you look at the diagram that I have there, the labeled pictures, 4 of them are either Naval or Marine. They wear the golden wings that we will be referring to. The other 3, Grissom, Slayton, and Cooper, are from the Air Force. They wore silver pilot's wings. They'll be talked about in another program called NASA's Silver Winged Astronauts, which will be coming up in a couple of weeks. So here we have our 4 golden winged astronauts. Alan Shepard, Scott Carpenter, Wally Schirra, all from the Navy. John Glenn from the United States Marine Corps. We're calling them the golden winged astronauts because they all shared one thing. They all had the golden wings of a naval aviator. We'll be discussing each one of these gentlemen in turn, going into their aviation and space careers with a little bit of biographical stuff thrown in just for fun. Alan Shepard is our first golden winged astronaut, born in 1923, and he passed away in 1998. We could say that his aviation career had its beginnings in the U.S. Naval Academy in 1944. He earned a Bachelor of Science degree in the 3-year condensed war program that the Navy had installed at the time. Upon graduation, he was assigned to the USS Cogswell, which is a destroyer in the Southern Pacific. He saw substantial action there. When he returned to the United States, he began flight training and originally had some problems. He was about to be washed out when he started taking some civilian lessons on his own and actually earned his civilian wings in 1946. This was kind of frowned upon by the Navy, but seemed to work for Alan. He improved his performance and earned the golden wings of a naval aviator in 1947. Alan was assigned to a squadron flying the F-4U Corsair. He quickly became carrier qualified and spent the next couple of years flying Corsairs off of carriers, primarily in the Mediterranean. Alan Shepard becomes a naval test pilot in 1950. He starts flying aircraft like this one pictured here, the F-2H Banshee. Did some high altitude work with it. Also tested out the feasibility of landing jet aircraft on angled deck aircraft carriers. Alan also did some unauthorized testing of the aircraft he flew. He allegedly did a loop around the Chesapeake Bay Bridge and would occasionally fly below minimums over the Ocean City, Maryland beaches. There was talk of a court-martial for these offenses, but it never appeared. Here we see 2 more aircraft that Shepard flew during his test pilot career, the F-4H Sea Ray and the F-3H Demon. You can see the aircraft were evolving very quickly at this time, and it's amazing the number of different aircraft he flew in just a few short years that he was a test pilot. Here we have even more advanced aircraft, the F-11F Tiger, a supersonic aircraft that was used by the Navy for several years, and the F-5D Skylancer, which never went into production, but was quite a remarkable aircraft in and of itself. 2 aircraft that Shepard flew that I single out from the others are the F-7U Cutlass and the F-8U Crusader. The Crusader and the Cutlass are both held in the collection of the Wings of Freedom Aviation Museum. The F-8 is currently on display, The F-7, as you can see, she's in need of some restoration. We've got to remember that first and foremost, the astronauts were pilots. And since they were, they needed to remain current. So the Air Force loaned NASA a couple of F-106s. And here are the 7 astronauts posing in front of the F-106B that they all flew. Another aircraft we could associate with Alan Shepard is the H-34. We have an example of one right at the museum here. Our version is called a C-BAT because of some particular characteristics to it. But as you can see, the H-34 pulled the Mercury 3 capsule out of the Atlantic when they recovered Mr. Shepard after his flight. That's an H-34 Seahorse. Spacecraft flown by Alan Shepard. First flight in space for Shepard was the Mercury Redstone 3. It was the 3rd flight in the Mercury program, but the first manned flight. They were using the off-the-shelf Redstone rocket, which was not intended for human flight. It was supposed to be a tactical ballistic missile used by the Army on battlefields. It was not even an intercontinental range, so it had nowhere near the thrust necessary to put a human into orbit. But it did have plenty of thrust to throw a human high enough to get him into space, and that's why they used it. They used it for the first and second manned launches and then abandoned it for more powerful rockets. The Mercury spacecraft was designed by the McDonnell Aircraft Corporation and was used throughout the program. It was a very small capsule, single occupant, and the pilot more wore the aircraft than he did sit in it. You can see a picture of Alan in his Freedom 7 spacecraft there, looking rather snug and cozy. Freedom 7 itself is sitting there as it is now displayed in the Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. Alan would be grounded throughout the Gemini program and not cleared for flight until the early Apollo program. He had an inner ear problem. But during that time, he had other functions within NASA. With Apollo, he was finally able to fly a true spacecraft into the heavens. He was the commander of Apollo 14, which wound up being the 3rd landing on the moon. His lunar module's name was Antares, and his command module was named Kitty Hawk. Alan Shepard became the 6th man on the moon, and he also became the first golfer on the moon. He had snuck a golf ball on board in his personal effects and had one of the Apollo engineers affix a club head to a geological sampling rod that they had to take to the moon. While he was on an extravehicular activity, he dropped the ball on the surface, and then, as much as that spacesuit would allow, he gave it the best golf swing that he could. Alan Shepard was the only astronaut to retire as a Rear Admiral from the Navy. Once he passed away, there were many, many memorials to him. There's many things named in his honor. But I think one of the most fitting is this. It's the United States naval ship, Alan Shepard. It's this dry supply ship operated by the United States Navy. John Glenn is our 2nd golden-winged astronaut, the only Marine in the group. He was born in 1921, and we lost Mr. Glenn in 2016. He was a naval aviator in March of 1943, having earned his golden aviator's wings through a program that fed pilots into the United States Navy during World War II. He was very quickly transferred over to the United States Marine Corps, where here we see a picture of John Glenn in the cockpit of an F-4U Corsair, the aircraft that he operated in the South Pacific during the World War II. He flew in 53 combat missions in that war and had received several different decorations. After the war, he transitioned to jets. And once he got to Korea, we would have found him flying the F-9F Panther. The Wings of Freedom Aviation Museum has a beautiful example of a Panther, which is actually painted up like a gentleman who was John Glenn's wingman for a while. Would have been Ted Williams. This aircraft is painted as Ted Williams flew it. During his time with flying the Panther in Korea, this was a ground attack aircraft, and John was a Marine flying ground attack aircraft profiles. As such, John got the nickname Magnet Ass after on at least one mission coming back with several holes in the aircraft. One particular flight came back, he had over 250 holes shot in the bottom of his aircraft. After some time in the Panther, he was then attached to the Air Force, where he flew the F-86 Sabre. The Sabre was a fighter. He was no longer doing ground attack, but he was looking for MiGs over MiG Alley. He was credited with shooting down 2 MiGs while he was there. Some people say that he got a third as well. After Korea, he becomes a test pilot in 1954 for the United States Navy, Marine Corps, and flies many different aircraft, a couple of examples of which you would see at Wings of Freedom Aviation Museum. Right here we see the FJ-4 Fury. He flew the 3 and was almost killed in one when the oxygen system failed. But it was actually an aircraft he was somewhat familiar with, because the FJ Fury is really just a naval version of the F-86 Sabre, which he flew in Korea. He also flew the F-7U Cutlass, being the primary pilot involved in weapons separation tests from that aircraft. And I don't include the Wings of Freedom Cutlass in this picture because I found one of John Glenn in the cockpit from Point Mugu, where he flew the Cutlass. Another aircraft that John Glenn was involved with as a test pilot was the F-8U Crusader, another one you can see right at the Wings of Freedom Aviation Museum. Project Bullet was a very interesting idea that Glenn came up with that let him fly an aircraft, the F-8U, from coast to coast at what turned out to be an average speed of well over the speed of sound. That meant that he was traveling faster than a bullet coming out of a gun. This feat, if you want to call it that, led to quite a bit of fame for him, and ultimately got him onto a show called Name That Tune, where he even became a little bit more famous. I don't want to go into too much more detail about Project Bullet, but it's incredibly interesting because I am hoping to develop a program on it alone sometime in the future. So once Glenn got to NASA, he was with all the other guys flying the F-106s to keep current. Since I'm bending the rules a little bit here, just like he did with Alan Shepard, we're going to associate the H-34 with John Glenn as well. He was the last astronaut recovered by the H-34. The Mercury 5 capsule was the second capsule recovered by that helicopter. In the early parts of this program, that helicopter was used to pluck the astronaut and the spacecraft together out of the water and place them on board ship. If you go to the Wings of Freedom Aviation Museum, you'll see the H-34 in its Seabat variant, where it was used to hunt submarines. Spacecraft flown by John Glenn. Let's start on the left with the Mercury Atlas 6. That was the name of the launch vehicle that put Glenn into orbit around the Earth. It was the 6th launch in the Mercury series. It used the Atlas booster. The Atlas booster was a borrowed intercontinental ballistic missile from the Air Force. Again, the rocket itself was intended to launch nuclear weapons from one point on the Earth to another point. By putting the Mercury capsule on top of it, we could roughly call it a spacecraft, although it's not. So the Mercury capsule is not very much changed from the earlier models that that Alan Shepard and Gus Grissom used. They're very small, extremely tight. The difference being here is that Glenn was the first astronaut to fly with a window. He could actually see outside, and some of his observations were quite interesting. There were a lot of things that went on during his flight, but I don't have the time to go into them now. They'll be covered later on when we do a whole program on the actual Mercury program, accomplishments, and exciting moments. That'll be sometime in the near future. John Glenn became, as he landed for the first human to orbit the Earth, a national hero, national treasure, celebrated far and wide. So far and wide that he was overlooked for any further flight until he finally got fed up and went to his bosses at NASA and said, "Hey, what's the deal? Why am I not getting any flight assignments?" And they said, "John, we've had order from the president that you not be put at risk, so we can't put you back into space." At that point, John retired from the space program. Went off to become something silly like a U.S. Senator, and he did that for several years. After John spent several years as a senator, the old saying kicked in, you just can't keep a good man down. And here he is in the back of a T-38 undergoing astronaut training for the second time at the age of 77. At 77 years young, most of his crewmates complained they couldn't keep up with him on STS-95 as they flew on Space Shuttle Discovery. John performed several experiments on himself and in the spacecraft while he was in space. He retired from the space program once he landed, and we lost John Glenn in 2016. There are many memorials to John Glenn, but I've included one here that I feel is fitting. It's the USNS John Glenn, which is a naval transfer dock ship operated by the U.S. Navy. Scott Carpenter is our third golden-winged astronaut, and an example of a common misconception that all the astronauts were required to have bachelor's degrees to be considered, and that was not the case. Scott did not have a degree until after he landed his Mercury spacecraft and was awarded it emeritus. So that scene you see where Chuck Yeager's going, "Oh, shucks, don't have a degree," and Tom Wolfe's Right Stuff, is truly made up. It was not a requirement that astronauts have a bachelor's degree back in 1959. So Scott was born in May of 1925 and passed away in October of 2013. He earned his naval aviator wings in April of 1951, a little bit later than the rest of the gentlemen. But at the time, he was a married man with a family. And when given the choice of jet aircraft, that were just emerging at the time, or multi-engine aircraft, he chose the multi-engine aircraft. Therefore, he flew the PB-4Y2 Privateer in his early career. Basically, it's a B-24 with a single tail. The Navy used them to patrol the oceans during World War II and afterward. A very large aircraft. He then flew later on in his career the P-2V Neptune. And in fact, Scott, when we compare him to the other astronauts, had more hours in the air than any of the others and was considered more fit, physically fit, than any of the others. It's probably because in his early career he was flying these patrol aircraft for 8, 10, 12 hours at a time, whereas all the rest of them were flying jets, which at the time could barely stay in the air for an hour. So in 1954, Scott becomes a test pilot for the United States Navy. And as we go through the various aircraft that he flew as a test pilot, if you are familiar with when these aircraft went into operation, you'll see that Scott was not on the cutting edge of these aircraft being procured, but rather he was heavily involved in the development of aircraft that were already being used in the fleet. So we look at aircraft such as the F-11F. He may have been in on the early part of that aircraft, but obviously the Skyraider, the aircraft below it, and very different from the Tiger, was already in the fleet for several years, but it was continuing to be developed and changed around, and other roles were being sought for that aircraft. Just like the A3D Sky Warrior was already in the fleet, but Scott was involved in the further development of that aircraft. It started off purely as a bomber. It wound up with many different roles, many different variants throughout its year. Scott, with his electronics background, was heavily involved with the P-5M Mercator, not an aircraft that's widely known. The Mercator was a spy aircraft that did electronic spying early on in the infancy of that whole science. Upon selection to the Mercury program, Scott left the test pilot game behind and got the opportunity to fly the F-106A and B because they were aircraft that were maintained by NASA, as I said earlier, to keep the astronauts' flight time current. Spacecraft flown by Scott Carpenter. There was just the one, Mercury Atlas 7. The Atlas booster was once again the ICBM, and the Mercury capsule was not much different from the one that Glenn flew, complete with the window. Scott ran into quite a bit of criticism about the way he conducted the flight and would never fly for NASA again. I'm going to leave the details just to your imagination at this point, because I'd love to discuss them at a future time when we talk about the Mercury program in depth. After his work with NASA, he became involved with another passion of his, which was the United States Navy's program called SEALAB. SEALAB was involved in trying to develop habitats for staying on the bottom of the ocean. And in fact, while he was involved in one of these experiments, he hooked up with a buddy of his who happened to be going by in his space capsule. Gus Grissom was in the Gemini flight, and he spoke with Scott Carpenter the first time that someone on the bottom of the ocean was able to speak to someone on top of or above the atmosphere. Scott often referred to himself as an aquanaut and an astronaut. And one of his major contributions to NASA kind of combined those two. He came up with a system of simulating being in space here on Earth. And that was the use of neutral buoyancy in a contained pool of water. He came up with a system by which astronauts could be trained in a rather safe environment underwater on Earth, so that they could experience the same sensations that they would in space. In appreciation for that work, NASA named the center that is all performed at the Scott Carpenter Station. Our last, but certainly not least, golden-winged astronaut is Wally Schirra. Born in 1923, passed away in 2007. Schirra stands out even in this group of individuals as having flown in space 3 times, on Mercury 8, Gemini 6, and Apollo 7. He was born to the parents who were barnstormers, and Wally began flying at the age of 13. He graduated from the Naval Academy in 1945 and served in World War II after graduating on the USS Alaska, which was a cruiser. In 1948, Wally earned his Golden Wings of a Naval Aviator and was assigned to the squadron that was flying the F-8F Bearcat, probably one of the fastest propeller-driven aircraft that ever flew. The next aircraft that Wally flew as his career progressed is the P-80 or TV-2, TZ-2. I forget what the Navy called it, but it was a P-80, and he transitioned into that in order to learn how to fly jets. This aircraft is viewable at the Wings of Freedom Aviation Museum. This one is actually inside our building. It's a beautiful example of a P-80. Once transitioning to jet aircraft through the P-80, Wally was assigned to the F-9F Panther. And as we know, the Wings of Freedom has a beautiful example of that aircraft. And it would have been what Wally flew as an attack aircraft for the Navy if he had not transitioned to the Air Force. Just like John Glenn, a Marine, was flying with the Air Force, so Wally Schirra, a Navy pilot, would be flying with the Air Force. He did 90 combat missions in the F-84 and is credited with 2 MiG kills. We have an F-84F at the Wings of Freedom Aviation Museum. It differs from the one that Wally flew in that Wally flew the straight wing version, and we have the swept wing version at the museum. When Wally came back from Korea, he was assigned to a weapons test facility. So while he was not considered a test pilot, he was flying a test regime, testing out weapons on aircraft, but not necessarily the aircraft himself. So what they were testing was an infrared heat-seeking air-to-air missile. When Wally fired it from the F-3D Skyknight that he was flying, the missile immediately started to loop around behind him, and he did a hard turn inside the missile's radius and defeated it. Very quick thinking for someone who had never flown that situation before. Later on, after some time with that facility, he does become a true naval test pilot in 1958, and he goes on to fly such aircraft as the F-3H Demon. A couple aircraft that we've discussed earlier that you can see at Wings of Freedom Aviation Museum. The Cutlass, he does quite a bit of work in the F-7U Cutlass and the F-8U Crusader. He flies the F-11F Tiger, the F-3H Sea Ray. One of the last aircraft that Wally Schirra flies as a test pilot is the F-4H, which is the Phantom. The F-42 Phantom is what we would know it as. And we are excited to say that we have one in restoration at the Wings of Freedom Aviation Museum. Hopefully you'll be able to see it at our museum real soon. You're seeing this slide for the 4th time because just like the other astronauts, once he became a member of the Mercury program, he was using the F-106 to remain current. Spacecraft flown by Wally Schirra. First time into space, Wally flew the Mercury Atlas 8. Not much change from the other spacecraft that were flown before his. Still using an ICBM as a booster and a tiny little capsule which didn't hold much more than the man itself inside of it. But we were making longer flights, and that's what Wally accomplished. And also a more accurate landing system is what he really set out to do on his flight, and he accomplished that. The next spacecraft flown by Wally Schirra was flown with his crewmate, Tom Stafford. They flew in Gemini 6, also known as Gemini 6A. The booster portion of that spacecraft was a Titan rocket. Again, a borrowed ICBM. Why it was called 6 or 6A is a long story that I would love to get into in another program all about the Gemini project. But basically what the two gentlemen did was flew that spacecraft into a rendezvous of another spacecraft. They held that position just a couple of feet apart for a few hours, and then they landed in the Atlantic Ocean. Wally Schirra next flew Apollo 7 along with Isley and Cunningham. The purpose of their flight, Apollo 7, the first spacecraft to fly after the Apollo 1 disaster, was to get the program moving again, make sure things were feasible and safe. Was it going to be able to get to the moon? They stayed in space for the length of a normal Apollo mission, and they splashed down in the Pacific, just like the moonshots were planned to do. Following this mission, Wally retired from NASA and went to work for some television people and did some writing and was a very successful businessman in his later years. One of the memorials to Wally Schirra, as I've listed with others, is this type of dry supply ship that the Navy has put out. It's the USNS Wally Schirra. Thank you very much for watching. I ask that you please visit the museum, the Wings of Freedom Aviation Museum in Horsham, Pennsylvania, once normalcy returns. Just a disclaimer at the bottom, please remember that I am the sole author of this presentation and that all the pictures are property of either the DVHA, NASA, or are in the public domain. Material presented here has been thoroughly researched for accuracy and that I reserve all rights to this material, both audio and video. Comments or questions should be directed to me, Brian Pheck@gmail.com. Please watch for announcements on Facebook. Future programs coming, and I don't know how quickly they'll be coming because, gee whiz, this took a whole lot more work than I thought it would have putting it together. But anyway, we're going to be hoping to put together Project Mercury, Silver-Winged Astronauts, The Rule That Killed the Sea Dart. That's actually put together 90% already. Aircraft Evolution, which is an idea swimming around in my head. And then, of course, I mentioned a couple as we went through today's program. Project Mercury, its accomplishments, and Project Gemini, I obviously would follow on. Many, many more. But I'm seriously hoping I don't have to commit them to this format and that we can do them live at the Wings of Freedom Aviation Museum. Thank you, one and all. Be safe, be healthy.